penknife, and when she heard him coming she wheeled, quivering. She had been waiting for him all day, and like an angry goddess she swept fiercely toward him. Dave pretended not to see her, but when he swung from his horse and lifted his sullen eyes, he shrank as though she had lashed him across them with a whip. Her eyes blazed with murderous fire from her white face. The penknife in her hand was clenched as though for a deadly purpose, and on her trembling lips was the same question that she had asked him at the mill. "Have you done it this time?" she whispered, and then she saw his swollen mouth and his battered eyes. Her fingers relaxed about the handle of the knife. The fire in her eyes went swiftly down, and with a smile that was half pity, half contempt, she turned away. She could not have told the whole truth better in words, even to Dave. As he looked after his every pulse beat was a new curse, and if at that minute he could have had Hale's heart he would have eaten it like a savage, raw. For a minute he hesitated, with reins in hands, as to whether he should turn now and go back to the Gap to settle with Hale, and then he threw the reins over a post. He could bide his time yet a little longer, for a crafty purpose suddenly entered into his brain. Bub met him at the door of the cabin, and his eyes opened. "What's the matter, Dave?" "Oh, nothin'," he said carelessly. "My horse stumbled comin' down the mountain, and I went clean over his head." He raised one hand to his mouth, and still Bub was suspicious. "Looks like you been in a fight." The boy began to laugh, but Dave ignored him and went into the cabin. Within, he sat where he could see through the open door. "Where you been, Dave?" asked old Judd from the corner. Just then he saw June coming, and pretended to draw on his pipe. He waited until she sat down within earshot on the edge of the porch. "Who do you reckon owns this house and 200 acres of land roundabouts?" The girl's heart waited apprehensively, and she heard her father's deep voice. "The company owns it." Dave laughed harshly. "Not much. John Hale." The heart out on the porch leapt with gladness now. "He bought it from the company. It's just as well you're going away, Uncle Judd. He'd put you out." "I reckon not. I got writin' from the company which allows me to stay here 2 years or more if I want to." "I don't know. He's a slick one." "I heerd him say," put in Bub stoutly, "that he see we stayed here just as long as we pleased." "Well," said old Judd shortly, "if we stay here by his favor, we won't stay long." There was a silence for a while. Then Dave spoke again for the listening ears outside, maliciously. "I went over to the Gap to see if I couldn't get the place myself from the company. I believe the Fallons ain't goin' to bother us, and I ain't hankerin' to go west. But I told him that you all was goin' to leave the mountains and goin' out there for good." There was another silence. He never said a word. Nobody had asked the question, but he was answering the unspoken one in the heart of June, and that heart sank like a stone. "He's goin' away himself, goin' tomorrow, goin' to that same place he went before. England, some feller called it." Dave had done his work well. June rose unsteadily, and with one hand on her heart and the other clutching the railing of the porch, she crept noiselessly along it, staggered like a wounded thing around the chimney, through the garden and on, still clutching her heart, to the woods, there to sob it out on the breast of the only mother she had ever known. Dave was gone when she came back from the woods, calm, dry-eyed, pale. Her stepmother had kept her dinner for her, and when she said she wanted nothing to eat, the old woman answered something querulous, to which June made no answer, but went quietly to cleaning away the dishes. For a while she sat on the porch, and presently she went into her room, and for a few moments she rocked quietly at her window. Hale was going away the next day, and when he came back she would be gone, and she would never see him again. A dry sob shook her body of a sudden. She put both hands to her head, and with wild eyes she sprang to her feet, and catching up her bonnet, slipped noiselessly out the back door. With hands clenched tight she forced herself to walk slowly across the footbridge, but when the bushes hid her, she broke into a run as though she were crazed and escaping a madhouse. At the foot of the spur she turned swiftly up the mountain and climbed madly with one hand tight against the little cross at her throat. He was going away, and she must tell him. She must tell him. What? Behind her a voice was calling, the voice that pleaded all one night for her not to leave him, that had made that plea a daily prayer, and it had come from an old man, wounded, broken in health and heart, and her father. Hale's face was before her, but that voice was behind her, and as she climbed, the face she was nearing grew fainter. The voice she was leaving sounded the louder in her ears, and when she reached the big pine she dropped helplessly at the base of it, sobbing. With her tears, the madness slowly left her, the old determination came back, and at last the old sad peace. The sunlight was slanting at a low angle when she rose to her feet and stood on the cliff overlooking the valley. Her lips parted as when she stood there first, and the tiny drops drying along the roots of her dull gold hair. And, being there for the last time, she thought of that time when she was first there, ages ago. The great glare of light that she looked for then had come and gone. There was the smoking monster rushing into the valley and sending echoing shrieks through the hills, but there was no booted stranger, and no horse issuing from the covert of maple where the path disappeared. A long time she stood there, with a wandering look of farewell to every familiar thing before her, but not a tear came now. Only as she turned away at last, her breast heaved and fell with one long breath. That was all. Passing the pine slowly, she stopped and turned back to it, unclasping the necklace from her throat. With trembling fingers she detached it from the little luck piece that Hale had given her, the tear of a fairy that had turned into a tiny cross of stone when a strange messenger brought to the Virginia Valley the story of the crucifixion. The penknife was still in her pocket, and, opening it, she went behind the pine and dug a niche as high and as deep as she could towards its soft heart. In there she thrust the tiny symbol, whispering, "I want all the luck you could ever give me, little cross, for him." Then she pulled the fibers down to cover it from sight, and, crossing her hands over the opening, she put her forehead against them and touched her lips to the tree. "Keep it safe, old pine." Then she lifted her face, looking upward along its trunk to the blue sky, and bless him, dear God, and guard him evermore. She clutched her heart as she turned, and she was clutching it when she passed into the shadows below, leaving the old pine to whisper, when he passed, her love. Next day the word went around to the clan that the Tollivers would start in a body 1 week later for the west. At daybreak that morning Uncle Billy and his wife mounted the old gray horse and rode up the river to say goodbye. They found the cabin in the Lonesome Cove deserted. Many things were left piled in the porch. The Tollivers had left apparently in a great hurry, and the two old people were much mystified. Not until noon did they learn what the matter was. Only the night before a Tolliver had shot a Falin, and the Falins had gathered to get revenge on Judd that night. The warning word had been brought to the Lonesome Cove by Loretta Tolliver, and it had come straight from young Buck Falin himself. So June and old Judd and Bub had fled in the night. At that hour they were on their way to the railroad, old Judd at the head of his clan, his right arm still bound to his side, his bushy beard low on his breast, June and Bub on horseback behind him, the rest strung out behind them, and in a wagon at the end, with all of her household effects, the little old woman in black who would wait no longer for the Red Fox to arise from the dead. Loretta alone was missing. She was on her way with young Buck Falin to the railroad on the other side of the mountains. Between them, not a living soul disturbed the dead stillness of Lonesome Cove. End chapter 31.